Ladies and gentlemen, imagine knowing your life is in danger before anyone else does. Imagine trying to warn the world, only to have disbelief and doubt surround you. This is exactly what happened to her, a woman who reported her own murder before it even happened. To everyone else, it sounded impossible, unreal. But in the world of true crime, sometimes reality is stranger, darker, and more chilling than fiction. The first chilling detail of this case begins with her warning, the moment she stepped forward and reported what no one could imagine, a crime that hadn't yet occurred. She walked into the police station not as a victim, but as someone who foresaw her own death. To the officers at the time, it must have sounded surreal, almost impossible. How could someone claim knowledge of a murder before it had even happened? In the world of law enforcement, cases are usually reactive. A crime occurs, evidence is collected, suspects are interrogated. But here, everything was reversed. The potential victim was actively predicting her fate, and yet, the system that should have protected her was slow to recognize the urgency. From the very first moment, she conveyed specifics. Her voice, steady but laced with fear, outlined threats she had received, locations she suspected were dangerous, and even people she thought might wish her harm. It wasn't a vague feeling or a paranoid fantasy. She had observations, patterns, and concrete incidents that raised red flags. She had noticed a series of unusual events that didn't add up in everyday life, unexplained phone calls that abruptly ended, strangers who seemed to be following her, and minor but persistent acts of intimidation. To her, these were pieces of a puzzle that foretold a grim outcome. And unlike most warnings that go unheard, she had the courage to articulate it clearly. Despite her clarity, the initial response she received was lukewarm at best. Law enforcement, trained to prioritize tangible evidence over intuition, found it difficult to act on a threat that existed only in potential. They were skeptical, cautious, and constrained by protocol. After all, how do you intervene in a crime that hasn't happened yet? Yet, every officer involved couldn't deny the urgency in her voice, the palpable sense of danger that surrounded her. It was as if she carried a shadow that no one else could see, a premonition that demanded attention. What makes this keynote so haunting is the juxtaposition of her awareness and the world's disbelief. In a typical crime story, victims report incidents after they occur: stolen property, assault, break-ins, threats, but in her case, the sequence was reversed. She had foresight, knowledge beyond ordinary perception, and yet the world around her moved at the normal pace, unable to fully grasp the immediacy of her peril. Imagine the mental strain of walking through life knowing something terrible is coming, trying to convince others while everyone else carries on as if nothing is wrong. That tension, that imbalance, is the heartbeat of this part of the story. Her actions weren't impulsive, they were deliberate and methodical. She documented everything, every message, every suspicious encounter, every fleeting sign of danger. In her notes, she described how certain individuals seemed unusually interested in her routines, how her movements were observed, and how subtle threats escalated over time. She even made audio recordings and photographs to accompany her report, providing a paper trail that would later prove crucial. This was not paranoia, it was a preemptive defense, a calculated attempt to create a record that could guide investigators if the unthinkable occurred. What happened next highlights the limitations of human perception and institutional inertia. While she waited for action, her anxiety grew. Every day carried the weight of potential catastrophe. Every stranger in a parking lot, every unmarked car, every whisper of the wind became amplified. The psychological burden of knowing your own death is possible, even probable, without immediate protection, is unimaginable. And yet she maintained composure, presenting herself to authorities with the calm determination of someone who understood that panic would not save her, but documentation and persistence might. In retrospect, the significance of her report cannot be overstated. It became the first thread in a chain of events that would later validate her fears and reveal the truth behind the shadows that had followed her. Without that initial report, investigators would have had nothing to guide them, no timeline, no context, no direction. It is the rare case where a victim provides the opening lead to their own investigation, a roadmap written by someone who understands both the danger and the psychology of the perpetrator. The premonition she communicated also forced law enforcement to grapple with the unusual nature of crime prediction. It challenged conventional approaches. Could a threat assessment be reliable if it came from the mind of the person in danger? Could intuition, fear, and careful observation form evidence strong enough to initiate protective measures? These questions, raised at the moment of her report, framed the entire investigation in ways traditional procedures rarely do. Ultimately, this first keynote, the act of reporting her own murder before it happened, is a testament to her foresight, intelligence, and courage. It is the cornerstone of the story, establishing both the tension and the suspense that define the case. It serves as a chilling reminder that in crime, danger is often present long before violence occurs, and that sometimes the voice of reason, courage, and insight comes from the very person in peril. Her report was more than a warning. It was a lifeline, a call to action, and a haunting prelude to events that would shock everyone who thought they understood the boundary between life and death. Her warnings were more than words, they were pieces of a puzzle that only she could see fully. While reporting her own murder was already extraordinary, what made it even more compelling was the specificity of her account. She didn't just say, "Something bad will happen." She described moments, places, and circumstances that hinted at a meticulous plan against her. There were subtle patterns in her daily life that suggested someone was tracking her movements, analyzing her routines, and waiting for the right opportunity. Every missed call, every suspicious glance, every unaccounted-for vehicle became part of a narrative she feared would culminate in tragedy. To her, the danger was imminent, real, and detailed enough to warrant immediate investigation. Law enforcement officers, trained to recognize threats, found themselves in uncharted territory. They had protocols for stalking cases, domestic disputes, and even repeated harassment, but a predictive warning, coming directly from the intended victim, challenged the very structure of traditional investigation. They listened to her meticulously recorded logs of suspicious events, shadowy figures appearing in her neighborhood, strange phone calls ending abruptly when answered, unknown cars parked near her house during unusual hours. She had noticed patterns over time, small inconsistencies that might have seemed trivial individually but formed a coherent trail when combined. In a world where most threats leave some tangible evidence, she offered both insight and foresight, yet translating that into actionable steps proved difficult. What made this keynote chilling was the psychological burden she carried while reporting these threats. Imagine living under constant surveillance without knowing who is watching or why. Each day became a balancing act, maintaining normalcy in the presence of family, coworkers, and friends while simultaneously tracking potential dangers, analyzing behaviors, and anticipating the worst. She could not reveal too much to those around her, for fear of causing panic or being dismissed as paranoid. Her courage lay not just in predicting her murder, but in doing so while remaining composed enough to document, articulate, and report the threat credibly. Her attention to detail was extraordinary. She kept records of times, locations, and individuals who acted suspiciously, even noting seemingly trivial interactions that later gained significance. For example, a chance meeting with someone in a grocery store, or an unfamiliar person asking oddly specific questions about her schedule, initially seemed inconsequential. Yet, she connected these fragments into a coherent warning that would later validate her premonitions. This was not instinct alone, it was a methodical, almost investigative process performed by the victim herself, turning her own life into a living, evolving case file. Despite her preparedness, the challenge remained, convincing others to take her seriously. There is an inherent skepticism when someone predicts their own demise. People instinctively doubt the unverifiable, and authority figures are trained to prioritize documented crimes over hypotheticals. She faced the danger of inaction simply because the system was not designed to protect someone before a crime occurred. And yet, she persisted, knowing that any delay could cost her life. The tension in this keynote comes from that liminal space, the race between prediction and prevention, foresight and response. Her report also carried a subtle but critical lesson for investigators: sometimes the victim's knowledge is the first piece of evidence. Traditional investigations often begin after harm has occurred, piecing together clues from crime scenes. In her case, the narrative was inverted. She provided the initial evidence, the warnings, and the context, placing investigators in the unusual position of preparing for a crime that had not yet transpired. This reversal heightened the suspense, creating a story that feels as much psychological as it is criminal. Her intelligence, bravery, and the peril she faced in the days leading up to the attempted crime. By documenting every anomaly, analyzing every behavior, and reporting the danger before it materialized, she became both a witness and a participant in her own investigation. Her foresight and courage not only shaped the trajectory of the case but also defined the suspense, tension, and emotional intensity that make this story unforgettable. The investigation itself became a web of tension, uncertainty, and unexpected twists. Law enforcement officers had to navigate a delicate balance between taking the victim seriously and avoiding missteps that could compromise her safety. Every lead had to be carefully evaluated, every piece of information cross-checked, and every potential suspect monitored discreetly. Unlike typical crime cases where the event has already occurred, this investigation was preventive, proactive, and unusually precarious. Each action, no matter how small, carried consequences. One wrong move could alert the perpetrator, escalate the threat, or even trigger the very outcome they were trying to prevent. Investigators quickly realized that the victim's insights were both a blessing and a challenge. On one hand, she provided unparalleled access to the mind of someone being targeted, details that no ordinary investigation could uncover. On the other hand, her knowledge came with urgency and limitations. She couldn't reveal her every move or every suspicion without risking exposure or panic. There were moments when her observations seemed minor, almost trivial, but seasoned officers recognized the danger of underestimating them. The case demanded patience, vigilance, and the ability to read between the lines of seemingly ordinary behavior. The tension in the investigation was heightened by the perpetrator's elusive nature. Whoever was targeting her had studied her routines, blended into her environment, and remained undetected for weeks or months. Detectives realized they were playing a dangerous game of cat and mouse, forced to anticipate actions before they happened. Surveillance teams were deployed, digital footprints were traced, and neighborhood canvasses were conducted, yet every move was a calculated guess. The perpetrator's ability to adapt and conceal themselves created an invisible clock, ticking closer to a potential tragedy with every passing hour. Adding complexity to the case was the psychological toll on everyone involved. The victim, already under immense stress, had to trust strangers with her life while reliving the details of every suspicious encounter. Investigators, meanwhile, were forced to make decisions in the shadow of uncertainty, aware that a misjudgment could result in failure and irreversible consequences. Colleagues, family members, and friends were drawn into the tension, their normal routines disrupted by a case that blurred the lines between safety and danger. Each new lead brought hope and anxiety in equal measure, creating a pervasive sense of suspense that extended far beyond the victim herself. Forensic and digital evidence played a crucial role, but it was far from straightforward. Phone records, GPS data, and security footage provided glimpses into movements and interactions, yet the perpetrator was careful: no obvious patterns, no easy access, no mistakes that could be exploited immediately. Investigators had to read between gaps in the data, interpret minor anomalies, and connect seemingly unrelated dots. Every small discovery had the potential to unlock a larger truth, yet each required validation, patience, and strategic caution. The third keynote emphasizes the extraordinary collaboration between intuition and procedure. The victim's detailed reports acted as a guide, while investigators applied methodology, experience, and technology to corroborate her warnings. Crime stories rarely showcase this duality: the victim as both witness and informant, the detectives as proactive protectors instead of reactive responders. In this case, the synergy between her foresight and law enforcement's expertise became the backbone of the investigation, transforming suspense into action, fear into measurable steps, and uncertainty into a structured effort to prevent harm. Highlights that crime is not only about what happens, but about what almost happens, the invisible threats, the unseen eyes, and the split-second decisions that determine outcomes. The story of her preemptive report and the investigative response shows that crime is as much a psychological battle as a physical one. Every detail, no matter how small, carries weight. Every precaution, every analysis, and every moment of vigilance contributes to a fragile line between danger and survival. The third keynote captures that fragile tension, the high-stakes chess match between predator and prey, where anticipation, observation, and expertise are the only shields against catastrophe. As the investigation progressed, it became increasingly clear that the situation was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The perpetrator was no ordinary criminal, they were calculating, meticulous, and frighteningly patient. Every routine the victim followed, every interaction she had, was potentially being observed and analyzed. Detectives understood that they were not only racing against time but also against a mind that anticipated their every move. This knowledge created an invisible pressure, a constant tension that hung over the investigation like a storm cloud, threatening to burst at any moment. The fourth keynote highlights the high-stakes environment in which law enforcement operated. Every step taken, every surveillance deployment, every phone trace, every interview, carried weight. Officers had to act quickly but with precision. They could not afford mistakes, because even the smallest error could tip off the perpetrator or put the victim in immediate danger. Unlike traditional crime cases, this one demanded preemptive action, preventing a crime before it occurred. This inverted the usual procedures, forcing investigators to predict behavior and anticipate threats with a level of insight that tested their training, instincts, and experience. Technology played a crucial role in this delicate dance. GPS tracking, metadata analysis, phone records, and digital communication logs became essential tools, providing glimpses into patterns that the naked eye could not detect. Yet, the perpetrator was aware of these tools and acted with calculated discretion, leaving only subtle traces for detectives to interpret. It was a puzzle that required patience and expertise, where even a minor misinterpretation could lead to catastrophe. Investigators became detectives in the truest sense, reading between lines, observing gaps, and decoding hidden meaning in what seemed ordinary. Equally critical was the psychological component. The victim's courage to report the impending crime was extraordinary, but it also placed her under immense stress. She lived every day with the knowledge that danger lurked nearby, that someone intended to harm her, and that her survival depended on the actions of others. Investigators, too, were weighed down by responsibility. The knowledge that failure was not just professional but potentially fatal added a unique intensity to every decision. The case required not just procedural expertise but empathy, intuition, and an understanding of human behavior at its darkest extremes. The collaboration between the victim and law enforcement evolved into a delicate strategy. Each communication was carefully monitored, each lead meticulously validated. Patterns were scrutinized repeatedly, every anomaly was a potential clue. In a situation like this, nothing could be taken at face value. Every detail mattered, the time a door clicked, the pause in a conversation, a shadow in security footage. These tiny fragments formed a map that could lead to prevention or disaster. Crime stories often hinge on this level of meticulous observation, where suspense builds not from immediate action but from anticipation, prediction, and calculation. This keynote also underscores the extraordinary bravery required in such situations. The victim, aware of the danger, had to balance daily life with vigilance, alerting authorities while maintaining normalcy to avoid raising suspicion. She became a key player in her own protection, navigating a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty with remarkable composure. Her proactive reporting transformed a potential tragedy into a live investigation, creating opportunities for law enforcement to act before it was too late. The tension that defines preemptive crime interventions. Unlike traditional narratives where the crime occurs and then is investigated, this story unfolded in real-time anticipation of danger. Every decision carried the weight of potential life or death. Every overlooked detail could have catastrophic consequences. The interplay of human courage, investigative expertise, and relentless observation became the foundation for survival. It illustrated that crime is as much about prevention and foresight as it is about resolution and justice. In the end, this story is a haunting reminder of how fragile life can be and how courage can emerge in the face of unimaginable danger. It shows that the line between safety and threat is thinner than we often realize, and that vigilance, foresight, and action can make the difference between life and death. The victim's bravery, combined with the relentless work of law enforcement, turned fear into a tool for survival, proving that even the darkest intentions can be confronted when people refuse to remain passive. And in the quiet before tragedy, sometimes the most powerful voice is the one that warns us of our own fate.